Small's lighthouse rises like a sentinel from the storm-lashed rocks off the coast of Wales, its iron frame battered by relentless waves and wind, a lonely outpost perched on the edge of human endurance. Within its walls, one keeper would face a nightmare beyond isolation, trapped with the lifeless body of his partner, forced to navigate fear, duty and the merciless power of the sea. The story that unfolded here is one of survival, despair, and the strange intersection of human frailty with the raw forces of nature. Amid howling gales and the spray of icy waters, you'll trace the harrowing path of Howell, the sole survivor of a catastrophe that tested both mind and body. From the claustrophobic galleries and creaking stairwells of the lighthouse to the turbulent seas that swallowed normalcy, every moment reveals the fragile boundary between life and death, and the haunting legacy left by those who dared to live and perish on Small's Rock. A lighthouse in the maelstrom. The sea around Small's Lighthouse is a place of unrelenting violence. Sharp rocks jut from the water, hidden beneath foaming waves that crash and hiss with a sound like a chorus of angry spirits. Storms sweep across the Irish Sea with little warning, and even in calm weather the water churns with a restless motion that never seems to cease. Standing 21 miles off the coast of St David's Head in Wales, Small's Rock is a solitary outcrop, barely wide enough to hold the lighthouse that has braved centuries of wind, rain and salt. Its foundation clings to the rock as if in defiance of the ocean itself, a narrow octagonal structure raised on 9 oak legs and lashed with iron, a precarious platform perched above the waves. The sea does not forgive weakness, and neither does solitude. The lighthouse was not always the modern, automated beacon it is today. In 1801, when Thomas Howell and Thomas Griffith were stationed there, the building was crude and spindly, barely able to withstand a fierce gale. The wind could bend the wooden cabin, shaking the timbers until the small hut swayed like a fragile ship in a storm. At any moment, the structure might have cracked or splintered under pressure, and the men living inside had no recourse but to endure it. Communication with the mainland was limited to rudimentary signals and sporadic ship sightings, and the weather frequently made such contact impossible. Supplies arrived only when conditions allowed, and the keepers were expected to maintain the light no matter what the sea threw at them. Each night the beacon's lamp cut through the darkness, a slender thread of hope for sailors navigating the treacherous waters, but for the men inside that light offered no comfort against the isolation pressing in from all sides. Reaching Small's Rock in 1801 was a challenge in itself. Boats could approach only when the tide and weather permitted, and landing on the jagged stones demanded careful skill. Even a seasoned sailor could be thrown against the rock by a sudden wave, crushed, or swept into the abyss. Once there, the men were trapped. There was no shelter beyond the lighthouse, no other humans for miles, and the ocean extended in every direction like an unbroken expanse of danger. The wind howled around the narrow structure, a constant reminder that the rock was not forgiving and the men were alone. Inside, space was minimal. The cabin measured barely 4.5 meters across, the size of a garden shed, forcing Howell and Griffith to live, eat and sleep within arm's reach of one another. Privacy was non-existent, and every sound of creaking wood, every gust rattling the windows magnified the tension that already simmered between them. The isolation of such outposts is not just physical but psychological. Modern accounts of lighthouse keepers often describe a creeping, gnawing anxiety that grows with each day spent surrounded by emptiness. The wind outside can become a voice, the waves a rhythm of threat, and the narrowness of the quarters amplifies every disagreement or silence between men. Howell and Griffith were already mismatched personalities. Both were capable and experienced, yet their temperaments clashed from the start. Small annoyances could flare into bitter quarrels, and even the simplest tasks, stoking the lamp, maintaining the structure, observing the weather, required coordination under conditions that tested patience to its limits. The sea outside was merciless, but so too was the pressure of living in a place where the smallest misstep could mean death. Every thunderclap, every jagged spray of salt water that hit the windows reminded them that they were entirely at the mercy of forces beyond their control. Lighthouses, like Small's, were built for endurance, yet the endurance demanded from men was rarely acknowledged in the records. Historical logs note the arrival of keepers, the weather, the status of the light, and the passing ships, but they rarely convey the tension, the fear, and the psychological strain of being stranded on a rock in the open sea. Keepers were expected to work without complaint, to uphold the beacon that kept hundreds of vessels from disaster, and to survive storms that could last days or weeks. There were no redundancies, no replacements, and often no realistic way of calling for help. Small's rock itself was notorious among sailors for the way waves could smash against its jagged edges, turning even a brief crossing into a perilous undertaking. At night, when storms tore across the water and rain whipped against the cabin, the lighthouse became not a haven but a fragile shell, barely keeping out the wrath of the elements. In those first days, Howell and Griffith would have begun to sense the rhythm of the sea and the wind, noticing how quickly conditions could shift from manageable to deadly. The smell of salt and wet timber would have been constant, mixing with the odours of food and fire inside their cramped cabin. The light overhead had to be maintained precisely, the wick trimmed and the fuel replenished, because even a moment of negligence could send passing sailors into disaster. Alone on a rock in the middle of the sea, responsibility weighed heavily. Each man would have been forced to confront his own endurance, his fear, and the tenuousness of life on that isolated outpost. Even the sound of their own breathing and footsteps would have seemed amplified, echoing in the tight quarters like a reminder that the only other presence nearby was a man they could neither fully trust nor escape. The stage was set for tension, isolation, and unforeseen tragedy. Nature itself seemed to conspire against those stationed at Small's lighthouse, and the human element, clashing personalities, fragile nerves, and the ceaseless rhythm of duty added a layer of uncertainty that could be more dangerous than any storm. In this lonely fortress of wood and iron, surrounded by the relentless sea, Howell and Griffith were about to face a test of survival and sanity unlike any other, one that would stretch far beyond ordinary endurance and into the realm of true horror. The lighthouse waited, perched above the maelstrom, and the men stepped inside, unaware that the storm would become far more than a battle of wind and water. 2 Thomases, 1 rock. The moment the boat shuddered against the jagged rocks, Howell and Griffith realised that the sea would soon be the only world they knew, and every step onto the spindly lighthouse made them keenly aware of the confinement awaiting them. Small's lighthouse rose from the waves like a stubborn sentinel, its timber legs embedded precariously into the rocks, buffeted by the relentless gusts that lashed the Irish Sea. The wind carried spray and salt, stinging their eyes and biting through clothing, while the ever-present swell rocked the landing platform with a subtle, insistent warning. The rock belonged to the ocean, and they were mere intruders. The original 1776 octagonal hut swayed slightly under the gusts, its timber frame groaning with the same sound as the restless waves below, a constant reminder that even the lighthouse itself was struggling to endure. Every plank, iron lash, and creaking joint seemed alive, threatening to betray them with a sudden collapse. The light at the top was modest, barely slicing through the storm at first, yet the weight of responsibility fell immediately upon the 2 men. No ship logs would forgive neglect, and the authorities expected the light to shine without fail come wind, rain, or unrelenting winter. Inside, the keepers measured their territory in inches rather than feet, the 4.5-metre room filled with a lamp, rations, barrels, and the narrow bunks that would now serve as their only refuge. 2 men, forced into a space the size of a garden shed, with no barrier from the constant sounds of wind, waves, and wood groaning under pressure. The air was thick with salt and smoke from the oil lamp, and the persistent chill seeped into every corner, emphasizing the claustrophobia that would soon gnaw at their minds. A silence heavier than any storm settled between them on the first night, as the wind rattled windows and the waves smashed the rocks, and each man felt the weight of another's presence pressing against his own thoughts. Neither man spoke, knowing that any conversation risked igniting the friction that already hummed beneath the surface. They were strangers in temperament as well as habit, forced together by circumstance and duty, and the night seemed to stretch infinitely, as if the lighthouse itself were holding them captive. Howell was meticulous, methodical, and quietly observant, while Griffith's temper and impatience were evident even in small tasks, their opposing natures colliding like the relentless tides outside. Howell measured every movement, every task, calculating for efficiency and survival, while Griffith's actions were sudden, his voice sharp and quick to scold. The subtle clash of personality transformed the tiny hut into a tension-filled arena where even ordinary chores, lighting lamps, hauling barrels, or scrubbing glass, became tests of patience and endurance. Documents from the Admiralty noted that 2 men were assigned not for companionship, but for practical redundancy, to ensure the light never failed. Yet the lighthouse's cramped interior made redundancy feel like a trap rather than protection. The structure had been built for necessity, not comfort, and no historical record suggested the men were prepared for the psychological strain of living in such extreme isolation. Every sound outside, every flicker of the lamp inside, heightened the awareness that survival was dependent on cooperation, yet cooperation came with constant friction. Hours were consumed by trimming wicks, maintaining the lantern, scraping grime from the glass, and hauling supplies up the spiral stairs, each action magnified by the echoing walls and the sense that the lighthouse itself was watching them. There was no escape from the routine, no reprieve from the hammering wind and spray, and the ever-present threat of an accident or illness lingered in every thought. Even the simplest task became monumental, and each movement reminded them that one mistake could mean disaster on this isolated rock. Simple disagreements, a misplaced tool, a spilled barrel of oil, a lamp that burned too low, became catalysts for tension, and every gesture or word seemed loaded with silent accusation. The walls, thin and warped with age, amplified even whispered criticisms into sharp echoes. In a space so small, so confined, the friction of personalities became a tangible force, as real as the storm outside pressing in from every direction. Outside, the storm never paused, and the distant cries of seabirds cut across the wind, reminding them that the vast, indifferent ocean was both protector and prison, and that no help would come until it allowed. Night offered no sanctuary. Darkness blended with the wind, and the lighthouse appeared to hang suspended between sea and sky. The keepers were prisoners of weather as much as of architecture, and every crash of a wave against the rocks emphasized the futility of escape. At night, shadows cast by the flickering lamp twisted across the walls, making ordinary objects appear threatening, and the creaking timber seemed to whisper of dangers they could neither see nor name. Even the simplest movement in the hut became laden with meaning, a potential spark for conflict or fear. The air was heavy with anticipation, as though the structure itself held its breath, waiting for the inevitable breakdown of calm. Meals were eaten in silence, sleep came in fitful snatches, and every glance carried unspoken questions of trust, loyalty and fear, slowly fraying the fragile bond that the 2 men had been forced to forge. The boundaries between duty and paranoia blurred, and the constant proximity to another human being, combined with the unyielding roar of the sea, magnified both their fears and their obsessions. By the end of the first week, the tension was palpable, and even the sound of the waves crashing against the lighthouse could not drown out the sense that the next misstep, human or otherwise, would have dire consequences. The isolation, the strain of duty, and the collision of 2 conflicting minds had already begun to alter their perceptions, preparing the stage for events that would soon become a grim and unshakable reality. In that fragile tension, with the storm beyond the walls still raging, neither man could have guessed that the next moment would shatter their uneasy balance forever. Death comes to Smalls. The wind howled louder than ever as Howell moved through the cramped lighthouse. Realizing that Griffith's condition was no longer just serious, it was life-threatening. The storm outside whipped against the narrow tower, sending sheets of spray over the gallery and rattling the thin planks beneath their feet. Every gust reminded him of the sea's relentless indifference, a force far beyond human control, and yet Howell could do nothing but stay by his colleague's side, trapped in a structure no larger than a modest garden shed. The lighthouse, meant to be a beacon of safety for sailors, now offered no safety at all for those inside it. Every creak of the wooden floor beneath Howell's feet seemed amplified in the silence, making the small structure feel more like a coffin than a home. Each step echoed through the cramped space, a stark reminder that the 2 men shared barely 5 meters of room, living, eating and sleeping in close quarters while the waves battered the rock below. The wind forced itself through cracks in the planking, carrying with it the sharp tang of salt and the ominous sense that the outside world was simultaneously distant and impossible to escape. Here, the sea had no mercy, and human vulnerability was exposed in its most unforgiving form. Griffith's breathing had grown shallow and uneven, each inhale a ragged battle, and Howell found himself measuring the passing hours by the pauses between coughs. Fevered and weak, Griffith seemed to shrink into himself, his face pale against the dim candlelight flickering on the walls. Howell kept watch for any sign of improvement, though each passing minute made it increasingly clear that time was working against them. The combination of exposure, stress, and the rudimentary living conditions left no room for recovery, and the knowledge that he was powerless pressed down upon Howell like the weight of the storm itself. Outside, waves slammed against the rock with relentless force, spraying salt water over the narrow gallery and reminding Howell that help from the mainland was impossibly far away. The lighthouse, standing 21 miles from St. David's Head, was designed to be a solitary outpost, and the isolation that had once seemed romantic now revealed its lethal reality. No signal could summon aid, no passing boat could reach them in such a tempest, and the sound of the sea pounding against the base of the tower became a constant, inescapable reminder of their vulnerability. Every crashing wave seemed a threat, every gust of wind a warning. The rudimentary supplies at hand offered little comfort. Bandages, rum, and a bottle of water were all that stood between Griffith and the indifferent cruelty of the sea. Howell did what he could to tend to his colleague, applying cold compresses, propping him up with makeshift pillows, and offering small sips of water when possible. Even these minor gestures required effort, for the rocking of the lighthouse in the storm made the simplest task exhausting. Every movement carried risk. A slip, a fall, a sudden surge of the waves could have turned this already grim scenario into a complete catastrophe. Howell tried to keep the light burning steadily, knowing that any lapse might imperil distant ships, even as his mind was consumed by the relentless fear of losing his companion. The lighthouse's beacon had always been a symbol of guidance and safety for mariners, but to Howell it became an anchor to routine and sanity amid the chaos. Lighting the wick, refilling the lamp, and polishing the lens required concentration, yet every action was shadowed by worry. In his mind, he weighed the lives of passing sailors against the dwindling chances of saving Griffith, a moral calculation that offered no comfort but demanded constant attention. The small cabin seemed to shrink as the storm worsened, walls vibrating with each gust, and Howell began to feel the isolation press against him with physical weight. He moved around the circular space carefully, acutely aware that even a single misstep could send him crashing against the walls or into the narrow gallery. The constant roar of the wind and sea infiltrated his ears and thoughts alike, making it impossible to escape the sense that the rock itself was conspiring against him. Every shadow cast by the candle became a shifting spectre, every creak of the structure a threat, and Howell realized that the terror outside had seeped wholly into the interior. Time became meaningless as he tended to Griffith, alternating between attempts at care and moments of helpless observation, realizing that no action could halt what was already unfolding. Hours bled into days and the storm showed no sign of mercy. Howell's body grew weary, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights, yet he remained vigilant. Every cough from Griffith, every laboured breath, punctuated the overwhelming solitude, reminding Howell that death was not an abstract fear but a present, palpable force pressing in from every direction. Thoughts of what awaited on the mainland haunted Howell. He knew that if Griffith were to die, suspicion might follow, and he braced against the idea even as the storm raged. Their colleagues and superiors might speculate about the cause, perhaps even question Howell's actions, though he had done nothing wrong. The thought of being accused while powerless to intervene added another layer of torment, one that pressed against his chest with almost physical weight. In the silence between the storm's blows, Howell wrestled with anxiety as oppressive as the gale outside. Night after night, the lighthouse trembled beneath the fury of the elements, and every lightning flash illuminated the contours of Griffith's face, etched with pain and exhaustion. The unrelenting storm painted the interior in stark contrasts, shadows flickering across the walls, while rain and salt water pressed against the glass panes. Griffith's condition worsened, his body weakened beyond the point where minor care could restore it. Howell watched the life drain from the man he'd shared months of duty with, each moment etched with dread, his own survival entwined with witnessing the inexorable decline. Howell's own body began to fail under the stress, but retreat was impossible, for the lighthouse offered no shelter from either the storm or the inevitability of death. Muscle fatigue, hunger, and sleep deprivation gnawed at him, yet he could not leave Griffith unattended. The cramped quarters allowed no separation between their suffering, and Howell became aware that the psychological toll was as severe as the physical. The relentless wind, the shrieking waves, and the oppressive confinement merged into an unbroken pressure that seemed intent on eroding every remaining fragment of his endurance. By the final days, Griffith's strength had nearly vanished, and Howell could only watch in silence as life ebbed from the man who had shared this desolate rock. The coughing subsided into shallow gasps, the body slackened, and Howell felt the moment of inevitability descend upon the lighthouse. He sat quietly, hands resting on the floor, listening to the storm and the small, final signs of life fading from his companion. In that instant, the full gravity of isolation, nature's brutality, and human vulnerability converged with a force that left no room for hope or distraction. When Griffith finally passed, the lighthouse was left to echo with a silence so complete that even the sea seemed to pause, leaving Howell utterly alone against the world. Shadows of paranoia. The first night after Griffith's breath ceased, Howell stared at the endless grey swell, feeling the lighthouse itself pressed down like a weight on his chest. Outside, waves struck the base of the tower with a relentless force, sending a spray that clung to every surface. The wind carried the sharp tang of seaweed and salt, mixing with the metallic scent of the lantern oil and the faint decay of the body lying only meters away. Howell had faced storms before, but never had he felt the cold so intimately, as if the sea itself had entered the room to claim him. Every groan of timber, every shift of the gallery beneath the hammering tide, seemed magnified, echoing through the narrow octagonal space and pressing on his mind. A flicker of light across the small room made him flinch, and every shadow cast by the candle or lantern seemed alive. The movement of the curtains, the sway of the window frame, even the brief reflection of water on the ceiling whispered accusations he could not name. The isolation stretched hours into days, each minute steeped in the quiet terror of knowing that no human voice would interrupt this endless vigil. The lighthouse, designed to pierce darkness for sailors, now seemed to invert its purpose, focusing every shaft of light inward and leaving Howell exposed to his own escalating fears. He began imagining the worst reports reaching the mainland, convinced that each passing ship might see a corpse and read him as a murderer rather than a survivor. Officially, Thomas Howell's colleague had died of illness or accident, but isolation had a way of twisting even verified facts. The mind, untethered from ordinary routines, turned speculation into certainty. Each ship log he remembered reading seemed to contain judgment, and every sailor he imagined scanning the horizon viewed him through the lens of suspicion. He counted the time between vessel sightings, calculated wind shifts and cloud cover, and told himself that the world beyond the lighthouse would interpret silence as guilt. Fingers numb from spray and damp, eyes strained from dim candlelight, and the constant gusts rattling the structure frayed his senses until the wind itself felt like a hand probing for his guilt. The small octagonal hut, barely 5 meters across, magnified every sound. The stairs creaked like joints in a tired body, the walls expanded and contracted with each gust, and the oil lamps flickered against the dark corners, creating shapes that moved independently of the wind. Howell's body responded to these minor disturbances with tension, and his heartbeat echoed in the narrow room as if he were constantly running from a threat he could not name. The body lay only meters away, and every fold of shrunken skin, every streak of salt and frost, pressed upon his mind, making Griffith's still form feel both familiar and grotesquely alive. Decomposition had set in. The cold and wind slowed the process, desiccating the tissues and leaving an eerie rigidity. The limbs appeared almost elongated, the fingernails curling like claws against the wooden floor. Howell could not turn away. Meals were eaten with one eye on the corpse, and sleep became a fragmented, restless drift, each startle of wind or crash of a wave waking him to the grotesque reminder of mortality. The body's proximity made him confront death in its rawest, most relentless form, and the intimate knowledge of decay began to twist his perception of the room itself. He swore he saw the shadow of a man where none stood, heard steps echoing over water and wood, and felt that the storm carried murmurs of judgment from the distant shore. Wind through these small openings in the gallery could sound like a whispered voice, and the reflection of lightning across the dark waves produced shapes in the glass that seemed almost human. At times, he imagined Griffith moving, eyes opening briefly to measure him, a silent accusation of failure or complicity. These sensations, rooted in the physical reality of storm, decay, and light, compounded in a mind pushed to its limits, creating a fog of paranoia that made even mundane details appear sinister. For hours he considered moving the body, hiding it, even daring to snuff out the light, each thought tangled with dread over what might be discovered when relief finally arrived. Howell weighed options that reality could not truly support, measuring risk against morality. If he hid the body, he might protect himself from suspicion, yet he feared the inevitable exposure. To extinguish the light was unthinkable. It might save him from immediate scrutiny, but endanger the countless sailors for whom the beacon existed. Each decision became a trap, each inaction a possible path to disaster. The ethical and practical dilemmas intertwined with his fear, heightening the sense of relentless suspense in every passing hour. Days blurred into nights, and the small circular room shrank around him, every sound magnified, every creak of the wind a reminder that he was utterly alone with both the elements and his own imagination. He measured time in candle burns and tidal swells, noted the shape of waves against the horizon, and counted the groans of the lighthouse structure, all to anchor his sanity. Yet the proximity of death, the unceasing storm and the absence of human contact created a pressure that could not be mitigated. His own shadow on the wall sometimes startled him, and his reflection in the lantern glass became a stranger, gaunt and wide-eyed, who shared the same space as a corpse. By the time he leaned against the cold wall, Howell sensed that the corpse was more than a silent companion. It had become a catalyst, a mirror of his unravelling mind. The physical and psychological toll of weeks trapped in the octagonal room had transformed him into someone unrecognisable, both to the world and to himself. Griffith's still body, pressing silently against the reality of the lighthouse, left Howell aware that the line between life and death, observer and participant, was dissolving. Each gust of wind, each crack of timber, became a reminder of his isolation, a prelude to the next crisis that the sea and sky might impose upon him. The lighthouse held him in its unyielding grip, and the quiet terror of what awaited beyond the next storm could not yet be named. Crafting the coffin. Reality struck Howell with a cold, unyielding weight as he confronted Griffith's stiffened body, lying barely a metre from where he had eaten and slept. The storm outside pounded the lighthouse, each wave reverberating through the timber walls, yet inside the more pressing violence was silent and grotesque. Howell had been trained as a barrel maker, his hands accustomed to shaping wood, measuring precisely, and hammering iron, but no amount of skill could prepare him for the intimate confrontation with death in such confined quarters. The air was thick with the metallic tang of the sea mixed with the acrid scent of decay, and every creak of the floor or gust against the lighthouse made the silence feel heavier. For Howell, survival was no longer merely a matter of tending the light. It was a struggle against despair and the tangible presence of mortality itself. The plan had been simple in theory: construct a wooden coffin to isolate the body and restore some sense of order to the living space. The bulkhead planking of the lighthouse, warped by rain and spray, offered material that would have been discarded in calmer circumstances. Howell examined each board with care, testing its strength and measuring it against Griffith's height, aware that any mistake could compromise the entire structure. Outside, the wind threatened to pry open the shuttered windows, and inside, Howell felt the walls of the lighthouse pressing closer with every moment he delayed. Each cut and hammer strike reverberated across the room, amplifying the shadows cast by the flickering candlelight and shaping them into grotesque dancing forms that mirrored his growing anxiety. Even as he worked, Howell's mind raced with the practical impossibility of the task. The space was scarcely larger than a garden shed, yet he had to construct a coffin that would contain a grown man, lift it and secure it without help. The rhythmic tapping of a hammer on wood became a metronome for his fear, each echo marking the passage of hours that might otherwise have blurred into endless isolation. He paused frequently, not for exhaustion but to force himself to breathe through the suffocating mix of salt spray, rot, and the mental weight of the task before him. The body's presence was unrelenting, a dark reminder that death had come not as a visitor but as a companion. Howell considered the structural limits of the lighthouse as he built. aware that every additional pound of timber pressed against the small floorboards would make the already precarious tower sway with each surge of the sea. The storm outside was merciless, and the gale shook the lighthouse with a force that threatened to undo all his work. Each nail he drove carried the tension of both craftsmanship and desperation. The wood warped under the hammer, creaking in protest, and Howell imagined the voice of the dead whispering back at him in the drafts that swept the room. The practical and the psychological were inseparable, as if the body itself weighed as much on his mind as it did on the floor. The act of lifting Griffith into the coffin demanded precision and nerve, and Howell approached it with a careful, almost ritualistic patience. He grasped the corpse with trembling hands, feeling the rigidity of rigor mortis, the subtle shifting of limbs hardened by death, and the cold texture of skin that had begun to lose its elasticity. The process required him to bend, tug, and pivot in ways that brought the body impossibly close, forcing him to confront the contours of a colleague he had once quarrelled with, now rendered utterly helpless and silent. Every motion was accompanied by the groan of the floorboards and the lashing of wind outside, a duet of threats that made the task seem simultaneously monumental and terrifyingly fragile. Once the corpse was positioned inside the crude box, Howell fitted the lid with a mixture of relief and lingering dread. He felt no triumph, only a tentative reprieve from the immediate horror of staring at a lifeless human so near. Yet even as the lid was secured, the awareness of what lay within cast a shadow over every action thereafter. Each meal he took, each turn at the light, was now performed in the presence of that coffin, a wooden reminder of mortality and isolation that no wall could shield him from. The room itself seemed smaller, the darkness thicker, and the sea outside more menacing, as if the lighthouse had become a stage for the interplay of death and endurance. The final, necessary step was to place the coffin outside onto the gallery, where the wind and waves might at least carry some of the weight away from the living space. Howell lashed it with rope as tightly as he could, fingers numb from spray and cold, praying that it would remain secure. The gale tugged at the timber relentlessly, and every second he spent outside seemed an eternity, a negotiation with elements beyond human control. Returning inside offered no solace, only a temporary withdrawal from the immediate confrontation with what he had done. The coffin's presence outside the walls became a fixed point in a day defined by uncertainty, the physical and symbolic boundary between life and death in a world ruled by storms. For days, Howell watched the structure endure the onslaught, noting the warping of the planks, the groan of nails, and the relentless battering of waves against the lighthouse. Sleep was a fragmented affair, punctuated by the sound of wood creaking and the wind's eerie whistles through cracks in the walls. Each passing day blurred the line between vigilance and obsession, with Howell measuring the integrity of his work while counting the minutes to relief, aware that even the most secure lashing might fail. The coffin was both shield and reminder, an object around which his thoughts, fears, and memories clustered with oppressive insistence. Through every hour, Howell's actions were shaped by pragmatism and the subconscious knowledge that human error could be fatal. His skill with wood, honed through years of labour, became the fulcrum upon which survival balanced. Yet the psychological weight of having to craft, lift, and secure a coffin in a confined, storm-lashed lighthouse eclipsed technical mastery. The body was an unmovable witness to every misstep, every hesitant motion, and every beat of his racing heart. In the midst of the storm, with sea and sky locked in a furious duel, Howell confronted the terrifying intimacy of death, solitude, and responsibility. By the time the gale began to ease, Howell had completed what might have seemed impossible, constructing a crude but serviceable coffin, lifting a human into it, and securing it against the unrelenting sea. The lighthouse remained standing, the light continued to rotate, and Howell survived the immediate ordeal. Yet nothing inside the tower, nothing in his mind, would ever be quite the same. The task had been accomplished, but the experience had etched itself into his memory with unyielding clarity. The coffin was finished, but the storm outside promised that the ordeal was far from over. Bound to the storm. The newly built coffin sat heavy in Howell's arms, a tangible reminder that the work was far from over and that the storm outside would not wait for his hesitation. Every step toward the gallery demanded careful calculation. The lighthouse rocked and shuddered as waves lashed the rocks below, and the wind shredded the night with relentless force. For a moment Howell paused, eyes fixed on the black horizon where sea met sky, realizing that what lay in his hands was both a vessel and a burden, a grim object that carried with it the full weight of death, isolation, and his own spiraling fears. He could hear the faint, mournful cry of seabirds somewhere in the distance, lost in the roar of the wind, a reminder that life endured elsewhere even as he faced the dead alone. Wind tore at the lighthouse walls with a ferocity that made even the stout beams quiver, rattling the door hinges and shaking loose small fragments of timber. Howell glanced around the cramped interior, the dim candlelight flickering over the planks, revealing salt streaks on the walls and the faint imprint of decades of storms. The gallery, a narrow platform circling the lighthouse and supported by iron braces that groaned under each gust, had been built to allow keepers to maintain the light and tend to its lanterns. Tonight it would have to bear far more than intended. The sea's roar below pressed against the rock in a deep, relentless rumble, as if warning him of the danger that awaited, while a fine mist of spray coated every surface in glistening brine. Each step onto the slick planks became a careful negotiation, the coffin's bulk pulling against him while the gale threatened to wrench it from his grasp before it reached the railing. His boots absorbed the spray from waves that towered higher than the lighthouse keeper might have anticipated, and the iron legs of the structure trembled as though signalling their protest. The lighthouse, built to withstand storms but not the weight of human obsession, shuddered under his careful movements. Howell's fingers went numb around the edges of the coffin, his muscles screaming in protest as he fought the wind, the rain, and the sheer gravity of what he carried. Salt stung his eyes, and each flash of lightning across the turbulent sea painted the deck in sudden, spectral clarity. The horizon offered no reassurance. Waves collided in tumultuous arcs, their crests foaming and boiling as they smashed against jagged rocks below. Spray filled the air, stinging his face and coating his jacket with brine, while the void between rock and horizon seemed endless, a black maw swallowing all light, all safety, and leaving Howell aware of his utter isolation. Even as he leaned into the gale, he could hear the distant crash of water against stone, the ocean's voice relentless and ancient, reminding him that the rock he stood upon was a fragment of permanence surrounded by chaos, and that any misstep could send him or his burden into the abyss. The rope felt like another adversary, stiff and unyielding, its fibres resisting his hands as he looped and tightened it around the coffin. Sweat and salt mixed on his brow as he twisted, knotted, and pulled, knowing that a single failure could undo hours of effort and allow the corpse to tumble into the dark waters below. The rope, weathered and fraying at some points, demanded absolute precision. Each knot had to bear the combined force of wind, waves, and gravity. As the storm tested him, the rope's tension became almost audible in the whistle of wind through its strands, a subtle reminder of the fragility of his precarious plan. Even once secured, the coffin seemed alive under the wind, rocking and creaking with the storm's rhythm. Shadows stretched and warped across the gallery floor as candlelight flickered, and Howell felt as though the dead were pressing back against their confinement. The hand he had glimpsed, pale and lifeless, seemed to occupy every corner of his imagination. Every groan of timber, every snap of rope became a signal, a whisper from beyond that Howell could neither ignore nor understand. The sound of the wind through cracks in the planking created eerie echoes, making it difficult to distinguish natural creaks from imagined movement. Gusts slammed the structure, making the lighthouse sway slightly on its iron supports. Howell braced himself against the railing, gripping the coffin to keep it from sliding. Waves below hammered the rock with a noise like 1,000 hammers striking wood and stone. Lightning illuminated the seascape, revealing jagged silhouettes, swirling foam, and the fragile boundary between safety and the abyss. Each flash brought a fleeting clarity, and then darkness returned, leaving him in the suffocating black, where only the wind's howl and the coffin's uneasy rocking marked the passage of time. Hours stretched interminably, with no relief from the cacophony. Each creak of timber or whistle of wind made Howell's pulse spike. His mind refused rest, scanning the coffin, the rope, and the shadowed corners of the gallery for any sign of movement or failure. Fatigue pressed down on his limbs, yet sleep was impossible. The very structure that had kept countless sailors safe now threatened to betray him. Survival required constant attention, unbroken vigilance, and an unflinching confrontation with the macabre reality he had created. Salt-encrusted planks beneath him offered little grip, and even a minor slip could have transformed his watchful torment into catastrophe. When a brief lull arrived, Howell's muscles ached from hours of strain, and he leaned against the iron railing, breathing in the sharp, briny air. The sea had momentarily retreated, leaving the lighthouse in a deceptive calm, yet the stillness sharpened his senses to the faintest sounds. The coffin, heavy and bound, remained at his side like a silent witness, reminding him that death was not an abstraction, nor a distant visitor. It was immediate, present, and inescapable. Even a seabird's cry far below seemed to echo the inevitability of nature's power, a reminder that he was only a single, vulnerable human on a fragment of rock. Even as he stepped inside to catch a fleeting breath, Howell could not shake the certainty that the coffin and whatever lay within would soon challenge him again. The shifting weight of death. The coffin in Howell's arms felt impossibly heavy, each plank soaked with the cold spray of the Irish Sea, and the gale outside tore at every inch of the lighthouse as if daring him to falter. He moved cautiously, measuring every step across the narrow gallery that encircled the structure, knowing that a single slip could send the body tumbling into the relentless waves below. Even the iron legs and oak beams, designed to bear the weight of the lighthouse itself, shuddered under the assault of wind and water, reminding him that this platform was meant to guide ships safely, not to serve as a staging ground for a macabre cargo. Rain and salt spray stung his eyes, blurring the black horizon where sea and sky seemed to merge into one unbroken void. Each wave smashed against the jagged rocks, rattling loose fragments of timber and sending a vibration up through the floor. The wind howled with a voice that seemed almost sentient, filling the small chamber with a cacophony that rivaled the ocean itself. Howell's hands were numb from exposure, gripping the coffin with desperation, and he realized that his work had only just begun. The storm showed no mercy, and neither could he. A sudden gust lifted the coffin, tipping it slightly toward the edge of the gallery. For a moment Howell froze, breath caught in his chest as he felt the corpse's weight shift. He pivoted, adjusting his stance, his boots slipping on the slick planks, bracing against the wind and the bulk of the box. Every movement demanded precision. A misstep would undo hours of labour, and the ocean below would accept no excuses. The rope he had secured around the coffin groaned, fibres fraying under tension, yet it was the only barrier between order and disaster. Flickering candlelight cast monstrous shadows across the gallery floor, bending the shapes of railing and rope into grotesque forms that seemed alive in the dark. Howell's mind, already pushed to its limits, conjured movement within the coffin itself. The corpse appeared to shift, subtly at first, and then more insistently, as though testing the bounds of its confinement. He blinked against the storm and wondered if the hand he had glimpsed once, pale and rigid, might somehow be pressing outward again, an unearthly echo of the man who had lived beside him only days ago. Muscles screamed in protest, lungs burned with every gust of icy air, and his eyes darted between the horizon, the rope, and the creaking coffin. The gallery rocked beneath him, trembling with the combined fury of wind and waves. Howell's grip never slackened. He moved with deliberate caution, inch by inch, until he reached the railing, pressing the coffin against it and bracing himself with every ounce of strength. A single misjudgment could undo everything. The wind would carry the body into the sea, and he would be left alone in the darkness with nothing but memory and horror. For a brief moment the storm relented, the wind dipping just enough to allow him to hear the low creak of rope and timber. The lull was deceptive, a fleeting reprieve that only sharpened his awareness of the coffin's instability. The ocean remained a restless giant, every distant crash a reminder that nature had dominion over the rock, the lighthouse, and all who dared occupy it. Even as he leaned into the chill, Howell felt the oppressive weight of the corpse, the knowledge of its presence pressing upon him as though demanding acknowledgement of the death he could neither undo nor escape. Without warning, a violent gust struck the structure, lifting one corner of the box and pivoting the body inside toward the gallery's edge. Howell pivoted with it, muscles taut, eyes squinting through spray and shadow. Every knot in the rope, every lash against the railing was a battle with inevitability. The coffin had become more than wood and nails. It was a device of suspense, holding not just a body but the fragile boundary between sanity and terror. Each tilt, each groan seemed orchestrated by the storm itself, a cruel and indifferent force testing the limits of his endurance. Even as he fought to steady it, the shadows and candlelight played tricks on him. The corpse's fingers, rigid from rigor mortis, seemed to twitch in impossible ways, as if probing the edges of its wooden confinement. The wind tugged and lifted, teasing him with the suggestion that life lingered where there could be none. The mind, in such extreme isolation and under such relentless pressure, seizes on the smallest details, and Howell's imagination merged with reality, making the still body pulse with a dread vitality he could neither verify nor dismiss. Hours dragged on with no end to the storm, and every small sound, the whistling of wind, the snap of a rope, the groan of timber, set his pulse racing. Fatigue pressed heavily on his limbs, yet rest was impossible. The lighthouse, built to withstand decades of the sea's assault, now seemed to conspire against him, threatening collapse or catastrophe at the worst possible moment. Vigilance was the only path to survival, and yet it carried a cost beyond the physical. The relentless tension wore at his mind, sharpening fear into a constant, gnawing presence. At last, a brief calm allowed him to lean against the iron railing, muscles trembling, body soaked and numb. The storm had withdrawn, if only temporarily, leaving the lighthouse suspended between sea and sky, a fragile island of human endeavour. Yet the coffin remained at his side like a silent witness, a reminder that the reality of death, the weight of his task, and the unforgiving nature of the storm had not diminished. The night was far from over, and Howell knew that even in this quiet the coffin's presence would continue to haunt him. The storm may have eased for the moment, but the coffin's dark weight pressed on him, and Howell understood that the night was far from over. Arrival of relief. The first rays of pale light cut through the dissipating clouds, revealing a sea still churning but far less violent, as if nature itself were catching its breath after weeks of unrelenting fury. Howell, exhausted and hollow-eyed, squinted across the jagged horizon, realizing that the nightmarish vigil he had endured was nearing an end. The storm's roar had dulled to a distant rumble, yet each wave that smashed against the rocks below carried the memory of relentless nights, when the lighthouse groaned under the assault of wind and salt-laden spray. In that fragile calm, the isolation that had been a torment now seemed almost surreal, the enormity of what he'd survived pressing down like the weight of the very iron legs beneath him. Salt streaks traced jagged lines across the lighthouse walls, and loose timbers groaned under the weight of lingering wind, a stark reminder of the structure's exposure to months of storms. The interior, dimly lit by a guttering candle, revealed layers of brine and grit embedded into every surface. Even the floorboards bore the marks of Howell's long struggle with the coffin, scuffed and scratched from where he had dragged it across the narrow gallery and hoisted it into place. Small rivets had loosened in the iron supports, and the thin wood of the gallery railing was warped from relentless exposure. In every sense, the lighthouse itself seemed exhausted, a witness to the human and natural forces that had converged upon it. When Howell finally removed the last barriers, the body of Thomas Griffith was grotesquely transformed, the prolonged exposure to cold wind and spray leaving the features unrecognisable yet unmistakably human. Skin had taken on an ashen grey pallor, while eyes that had once reflected life were now sunken and blank, staring into an abyss that no one could fully understand. Rigor mortis and desiccation had combined to stiffen the limbs, while the gale and salt had contorted the corpse in ways that gave the illusion of movement even after death. Every detail of the body told a story not of violence but of exposure, neglect, and the unrelenting cruelty of isolation in a place designed to keep others safe at the expense of the keeper. Muscles still trembling from the long hours of struggle, Howell's eyes reflected a man stretched to the limits of endurance, both physically battered and haunted by the intimate proximity to death. He swayed as he leaned on the gallery railing, gripping the iron to maintain balance, while memories of nights spent listening to the wind tearing at the coffin seemed to echo in every creak and groan of the tower. Hunger, fatigue and fear had etched themselves into his face. Yet more insidiously, The mental weight of constant vigilance had hollowed out a part of his mind, leaving him hyper-aware of every shadow and every sound, each one capable of triggering panic. It was a fragility not visible from the outside, yet undeniable in the way he moved and spoke. The relief crew arrived cautiously, their boat pitching against the residual swell, each step onto the rock deliberate and measured, guided by maritime protocols long designed for isolated lighthouses. Mariners had long known that the Smalls, though small in name, posed immense risks, with iron legs perched on sharp rocks and surrounded by a sea that could turn vicious without warning. Ropes were secured and lines were tied to maintain stability, while eyes remained fixed on every movement of the gallery. As the men climbed toward Howell, they noted the marks of the storm's power, these salt-encrusted windows, the warped wood, and the iron struts that shuddered beneath their weight, documenting the state of the structure in meticulous logs, as required by the Trinity House authorities who oversaw the lighthouse. Every motion was methodical as the men secured the corpse and inspected the gallery for storm damage, checking iron supports, bolts and planks in accordance with verified lighthouse maintenance procedures. The coffin, now relieved of its previous position lashed to the rail, was carefully lifted and lowered, the body inside handled with respect and precision. Each plank was examined, each knot in the rope inspected, and every creak of timber noted in their records. The lighthouse had survived, but only just. The combination of natural fury and human endurance had left its mark on both the structure and the keeper who had remained there alone, a grim reminder of the demands placed on those who maintained Britain's coastal safety. Logs were filled with detailed entries, noting the extreme weather, Howell's isolation, and the tragic outcome, ensuring that the Smalls Lighthouse incident would be preserved as a case study in maritime risk and human endurance. Reports described how two men, alone on a spindly octagonal tower of oak and iron, had faced storms of relentless intensity, and how one had succumbed to exposure while the other fought to preserve both life and duty. The observations made during the relief operation provided a lasting framework for future safety measures, including the eventual requirement for 3 keepers during the winter months, a policy directly influenced by this extraordinary episode. Even as the sun climbed higher, Howell stood on the gallery, surveying the battered tower and endless horizon, aware that the sea could claim lives again with little warning, and that the echo of this ordeal would remain with him forever. The isolation, the physical toll, and the intimate brush with death had altered him, leaving a fragile shadow of the man who had arrived at the Smalls weeks earlier. The lighthouse itself, though repaired and maintained in the future, would always carry the memory of those weeks. The groaning timber, the salt-streaked windows, and the storm that spared no mercy. Howell's story became a cautionary tale, a record of survival under circumstances that combined human vulnerability with nature's inexorable might. The relief had finally arrived, yet the ghost of those weeks at Smalls Rock lingered, leaving a silence that was heavier than any storm. Echoes of the lighthouse. Long after Howell's ordeal, the sea around Smalls Rock carried an unsettling stillness that seemed to hum with memory, as if the lighthouse itself had absorbed the storm's terror. Though the structure continued its duty of guiding ships, there was a tangible sense that something of those weeks, the struggle, the death, the horror, remained suspended in the iron and stone. Mariners who passed the rock often reported an unaccountable heaviness in the air, a tension that could not be explained by weather or tide alone, as though the lighthouse retained a consciousness shaped by tragedy. The waves struck the base with the same ferocity as before, yet the observers claimed the sound now carried a strange resonance, echoing human presence where none should exist. On fog-bound nights, passing sailors recorded flashes of light and shapes that could not be explained by reflection or lanterns, anomalies appearing too frequently to be dismissed as chance. Some claimed to see a figure pacing the gallery, cloaked in the shadow of the lantern room, moving with a deliberation that suggested both watchfulness and mourning. Instruments occasionally detected irregular light patterns, too precise to be natural phenomena, yet without any human operator present. Reports detailed instances of sudden gusts that rattled ship rigging at the exact moment strange silhouettes were glimpsed, as if the lighthouse itself exerted influence beyond its walls. Even seasoned mariners, familiar with storms and optical illusions, described sensations of being watched, their nerves taut in the unnatural quiet between waves. Fishermen and coastguards whispered about sudden movements atop the tower, shadows that darted along the gallery, and lights that seemed to flicker with intent, despite the lighthouse standing unmanned. These accounts often coincided with rough seas, though no one could link the sightings to wind or tide alone. Stories passed along the coast told of previous keepers experiencing inexplicable sounds, the creak of footsteps in empty galleries, muffled thuds that echoed across the rock, and moments where the beacon seemed to sway as though someone had touched it. Whether these were products of imagination or remnants of a tragedy trapped in the very structure, each retelling added to the lighthouse's growing legend as a place that had endured more than mere storms. Maritime officials and subsequent keepers noted that the story of Howell and Griffith haunted the culture of lighthouse work, influencing decisions about staffing, inspections, and safety protocols long after the events. Manuals began including detailed notes about maintaining emotional resilience, coping with isolation, and monitoring structural stress, all derived from Small's infamous incident. Researchers cited the psychological impact on keepers as evidence that prolonged solitude combined with proximity to death could amplify perception, often turning ordinary sounds into portentous signals. The legacy of the tragedy influenced policy, ensuring that no single keeper would face the rock's isolation alone, yet the shadow of Smalls persisted in every handbook and report. Automation in 1987 did not silence the mystery. Mechanical anomalies, unexplained flickers, and misaligned beams of light continued to unsettle observers. Systems designed to operate the lighthouse remotely occasionally failed in ways that were difficult to reproduce, leaving beams of light sweeping across the sea erratically, sometimes in sequences reminiscent of human gestures. Engineers sent to investigate could find no fault, yet multiple crews documented the same patterns, suggesting that some unseen force or memory embedded in the tower persisted. Even digital recordings picked up subtle irregularities, strange pulses in the equipment that defied logical explanation, reinforcing the notion that Smalls retained a trace of the events that had unfolded centuries before. The iron supports and wooden galleries groaned and twisted in the wind, producing echoes that could resemble footsteps or voices, often coinciding with reports of ghostly figures near the lantern room. Strong gusts carried a chorus of sounds up the tower, bouncing against the stone and metal in unpredictable ways. Some witnesses described the noise as whispers or low murmurs, almost like a fragmented conversation from the past, carrying a timbre that unsettled even the most rational listener. Visitors to nearby waters found themselves imagining figures leaning out from the windows, though careful inspection revealed nothing. Still, the echoes were enough to make even experienced seafarers respect the legend of the lighthouse. Crew members of passing cargo ships sometimes described seeing a solitary figure moving behind the windows, crouched or gesturing, yet no one had set foot on the lighthouse for decades. Accounts often coincided with dense fog or turbulent seas, moments when visibility was low and tension high. One observer noted a shadow that seemed to mimic human motions perfectly, disappearing abruptly when the ship drew nearer, leaving only the impression of presence. Another described the faint glint of a lantern held aloft for an instant, though the rock had been automated and unmanned for years. These cumulative observations fed a narrative that Smalls was more than a navigational aid. It was a repository for memory, grief, and an enduring sense of dread. The swirling fogs and unpredictable tides around the rock sometimes warped perception, creating optical illusions, yet multiple independent witnesses reported the same eerie sensations, suggesting something more than coincidence. Reflections off the churning waters could produce fleeting figures in the lantern's glow, and rogue waves occasionally cast shadows across the gallery in ways that tricked even the sharpest eye. However, the consistency of reports over time, and across different crews and conditions, suggested that the lighthouse might exert a lingering influence on perception, blending natural phenomena with the residue of trauma embedded in its walls. Writers, historians, and local storytellers preserved the tale, blending historical record with anecdotal sightings, turning Smalls Lighthouse into a symbol of enduring mystery and human vulnerability. Accounts of Howell and Griffith were cited in maritime journals, analysed in folklore studies, and retold in local histories, often emphasising the psychological strain of isolation, the unpredictability of nature, and the proximity of death. The narrative of Smalls became a case study for how environments can retain the imprint of extraordinary events, a lesson echoed in lighthouse safety, literature, and legend alike. As storms passed and the lighthouse continued its duty, the memory of those weeks in 1801 lingered, a reminder that isolation, fear, and death can leave invisible imprints on both structures and human imagination. Each new keeper or observer felt a subtle pressure, a sense that the tower remembered the terror it had witnessed and the lives it had shaped. Even the modernised systems of the automated light could not erase the psychological resonance that clung to the rock, nor the stories that perpetually circle the coasts of Wales and Cornwall, cementing Smalls as a place where history and mystery intertwined. Approaching the rock at twilight, one cannot shake the sensation that the lighthouse is alive with echoes of the past, patiently waiting to reveal what it has witnessed.